Okay, guys, welcome to Fundamentals of Health and Lifespan Development. So in this lecture, we're going to start with part 1 and part 2 by discussing some key concepts that are going to appear consistently throughout the subject. Then we're going to move into some conception and genetics. We're going to learn about how we are who we are today, why we have brown hair, blue eyes, how come some of you are tall, some of you are short, some are smarter than others maybe. And then we're going to look at the genetics of athletic performance. So whether there are genes that can determine our success in different athletic events. All right, so let's get right into it. Health and physical activity. Now, when you ask someone what their definition of health is, normally they would say something like it's a life without disease or life without illness. But the World Health Organization actually defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not just this absence of disease or absence of illness. That term infirmity just means physical or mental weakness. So the World Health Organization takes this larger approach to health, and it encompasses these 6 components of health. So firstly, our physical health, which is the way that our body functions, whether we've got any physiological diseases. Our social health, which is about the quality of our relationships with family and friends. The environmental health includes things like access to clean water, access to sufficient food, and even air pollution. And then emotional health, which is being able to express our emotions in a positive and non-destructive type of way. We've got having spiritual direction and purpose. And that spiritual health also includes things like our ethics, our morals, and also our values. And then finally, our mental health, including things like anxiety, depression, and our ability to cope with the demands of daily life. So they looked into what contributes to our overall health status. If these are the components of health, what contributes to them? Is it the way we behave? Is it our genetics, our access to medical care? And what they found was that there's actually quite a variation in the contributors to overall health status. So 20% is genetics. So our overall health status is influenced by our genetics by around 20%. So that's actually quite a large chunk if you think about it. So 20% of your health can be affected by what your parents give to you. And I guess that's why you so often hear that the key to life or the key to success is picking the right parents. Now, unfortunately, that's not a choice that any of us get. 20% also from the environment. So we spoke about that before. If you live somewhere that exposes you to infectious diseases, or you have a poor food or water source, even living in a neighborhood with a high crime rate can affect your health and longevity. Perhaps you can't get out and go for a run along the streets for fear of your safety. What's quite interesting is that only 10% comes from access to medical care. So considering all of the pills and all of the procedures that are prescribed nowadays, they really only influence our overall health status by around 10%. Now, obviously, this is quite different if you're someone living with a serious disease or illness. Medical care is going to help you a whole lot more than someone who isn't living with a serious disease. However, for the general population, it's only influenced by around 10%. And then the largest chunk of our health status coming from our health behaviors. And there's 3 key health behaviors that are most closely associated with our overall health status, and that is physical activity, so the amount of exercise that we do per week. That is smoking, so whether or not you're a smoker, and also your diet, so what are you eating in a day. Now, in terms of the knowledge surrounding these health behaviors, governments, policymakers, and even media has done a great job around smoking. Everyone knows that smoking is bad for your health. I think you'd be very hard pressed to find someone who thinks that smoking is good for you. I guess it depends what you're smoking though. So some people might have a different opinion. Now, the diet is another one that's been highly publicized. I'm sure you can name 5 diets off the top of your head right now. There's the keto diet, the Atkins diet, low carb diet, vegan diet, intermittent fasting. There's millions of them. You can hardly turn on the TV or open up Instagram without seeing all the new diets and how fat the population is becoming. So the real problem with diet is that it's hard to get 5 people to agree on what the messaging should be around a healthy diet. However, overall, the media and governments and policymakers have done a good job with telling the population that smoking is bad and teaching the population why, and also telling the population that our diet matters and why our diet matters. Now, physical activity or exercise is the outlier. Now, exercise, it's really crystal clear. We know what to do and how to do it. My nan has told me a million times that she needs to go out and walk the block, but she just doesn't have the time to do it. So we all know that it's important, but it's crazy how much physical activity has been neglected in a healthcare setting. So we don't know the harmful effects of inactivity. And whilst we do hear about the beneficial effects of it, we really don't hear that side about how harmful physical inactivity is. Now, the harmful effects of inactivity were looked at closely in a study by Lee in 2012. Not Lee from Functional Anatomy, this is a different Lee. They compared how bad smoking is and how bad inactivity is for your health, and they compared the global deaths per year that could be attributed to smoking and could be attributed to inactivity. And what they found was that overall both of them accounted for close to, just over 5 million deaths per year. Right? That's a really big number. And actually, inactivity is slightly more, with 5.3 million deaths per year and smoking at 5.1. Now, I'm sure if you asked anyone, they would say that smoking is way worse for you than being inactive. And inactivity here was measured as less than 2.5 hours of moderate intensity exercise per week. So that's going on a 30-minute walk per day. Now, the benefits of physical activity are often highlighted in the news, in social media. We know that physical activity is good for us, but the dangers of inactivity have not received enough attention. We don't realize that being inactive can kill us just as much as smoking can. Right? So it's something that we're going to discuss more in this subject, and we're going to talk about how we can get people to be more active at different stages across their life. Now, there was actually a task force that was dedicated to looking at the effect of physical inactivity around the globe. And this task force was put together by The Lancet. Now, The Lancet is a journal, so it's one of the top scientific journals where all of the most famous scientists publish their literature or publish their research. And what this task force said back in 2012, they said, in the view of the prevalence and global reach and health effect of physical inactivity, the issue should be described as a pandemic. Now, we all know what a pandemic is right now. Can you imagine if physical inactivity was taken as seriously as COVID-19? Can you imagine what a different world this would look like? A pandemic, that's not a small thing. Physical inactivity should be described as a pandemic. So that was back in 2012. It's still a significant issue. In 2016, the same task force was urging these governments and societies to take immediate, bold action to help make active living more desirable, more affordable, and accessible. So this is the overall view of the top researchers, the top scientists in the world. And we still see inactivity so prevalent in society. Now, eliminating physical inactivity could prevent 5.3 million deaths per year. So we saw that in that previous chart where inactivity was contributed to 5.3 million deaths per year. If we could just eliminate that, it would prevent those deaths. It would extend the life expectancy of the population in the world by 0.68 years. Now that seems low, about half a year, a bit more than half a year. It seems low, but that's because it represents the gain in the whole population. So that would be including both active and inactive people rather than just the inactive people who become active. So that gain of 0.6 years is actually very impressive. And they also found that we could extend the life expectancy of just inactive people by 1.5 to 3.5 years. And that was in the US. Now, eliminating physical inactivity as a whole, it would require a change in behavior. How do we get people to start doing more activity? How do we reduce sedentary behavior? It's got to be this change in this learned behavior. And there's two things that control behavior: our genetics and our environment or lifestyle. And that is where the argument for nature or nurture comes in. So we're going to discuss nature and nurture a lot today. So what influences our behavior and our functioning as a human being, and it's always this combination of genetics and environment. So if we want to change in behavior, we're going to have to look closely at this relationship between nature and nurture. And then here we have the list of all of the health benefits of physical activity in adults. We've got strong evidence for reduced risk of high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, cancers, depression, and just overall mortality, which is death. And we've also got strong evidence for things like increased cardiorespiratory fitness, improved cognitive health, improved functional health, and bone health. So there's so many benefits to physical activity, and we're going to delve deeper into these when we look specifically at populations like children, adolescents, and adulthood in the second half of the semester. But right now, here's a general slide detailing the benefits of activity. All right, so we've covered generally health and physical activity. What is health? How does physical activity influence our health? And now we're going to talk more about lifespan development. Okay, so lifespan development is essentially the study of how we grow into who we are. It tries to explain the changes in our cognitive functioning, in our psychosocial development, and even the physical changes throughout our lives. We know that we go from being this cute baby with supple skin to eventually we're going to be old, we're going to have wrinkles, we're going to have saggy skin. And so lifespan development is just the study of these changes. It's this changes in growth, not only physical growth, mental growth, cognitive growth, social growth, moral growth as well. And it also tries to explain the consistencies. So consistencies in personality throughout the lifespan. The main focus of the study of lifespan development is on childhood, and that's because that's where most of the huge changes in our growth and development occur. If you think about it, in a period of 14 years, we go from being this baby to being a functioning person, being able to read and write and walk around and speak. So the goals of the study of lifespan development is to describe and explain these changes, but eventually it's to optimize human development. So we want to know how we develop so that we can promote successful development, promote successful aging, and then live functioning lifestyles into old age. Now, both our genes and also our environment influence our development. They influence our development when we're still in our mum's bellies, and they continue to influence our development until the day we die. Development is something that always occurs. We're always developing, whether that be a mental way or a physical way. We're always changing. And there's one thing that's inevitable, and that's that we're all going to age. So being able to optimize the aging and development process is important for all of us. There's a few definitions that we need to know before we continue with this subject. The first is development, the systematic pattern of change throughout an individual's life. Growth is simply an increase in physical size, the physical transformation that goes on from when we're a kid to when we're, in middle adulthood. And it's involves hyperplasia, and hyperplasia is an increase in the size of the tissue, resulting in the increase in the number of cells in the body. So we're growing in size, and that's because we're growing in cells, which are making us bigger. Now, maturation refers to the organizational changes in the function of organs and tissues. So it's qualitative functional changes that occur with age. And these are relatively uninfluenced by experience. Now, our development, say, if we think about the brain and we think about the way that we think and the way that we process our thoughts can definitely be influenced by environment, or by our experiences, by our environment, the way that we're brought up. However, maturation is uninfluenced by these things. It's something that we're all going to go through. We all go through puberty at relatively the same time, regardless of where we were brought up, what culture we were brought up in. Okay, and then finally, biological aging. It's the progressive decline in our physiological functioning. So we know that as we age, we gradually are going to accumulate all of this damage to our cells and all of our tissues, and that's going to inevitably lead to death. All right, so development. What are the changes in human development as we age, as we go from a child to this old person? We have changes in our cognitive capabilities, in our physical form, in our physical capabilities. Even our moral perspectives change. We might have changes in our personality, or even constances in our personality. So personality staying the same across the lifespan. And then we've also got changes in our roles and responsibilities. So these are things like our societal expectations. Obviously, our role in a family is different when we're a child compared to when we're an adult and we're required to provide for that family. So our roles and responsibilities also change throughout the lifespan. Now, when we discuss lifespan development as a whole, there are really three main domains that encompass all of these changes. Now, the first one is cognitive development. So cognitive development, it's concerned with our thought and our mental and intellectual processes. This includes things like perception, attention, our language, our learning, even things like our memory, intelligence, creativity, and problem solving as well. So anything related to the mind. Then we have psychosocial development in the blue there. Psychosocial development, that is the combination of our psychology and our social development. It's concerned with the interactions between social and interpersonal interactions. So things like our motives, our emotions, personality traits as well, our moral development, our social skills, our relationships within our families, and then we have the physical development. So that's the things that we can see as we age. So the wrinkles that are going to start to come as we get taller, from a baby to an adolescent, as we start to, gain fat as we move through puberty. So things that we can see, and also things that we can't see, like our biological processes. So things like genetic inheritance, the growth of our body and its organs. We also have the functioning of our physiological systems, like the way that our body functions, and that includes the brain. So cognitive development is what the brain can do, and physical development looks at the actual biological development of the brain. Physical development also includes the physical signs of aging and the changes that we have in our motor abilities. So whether we're able to, run as fast as we could when we were a kid compared to when we're older, are we going to be able to maintain that level of physical functioning? Probably not, but that is also a component of physical development. Now, looking closer at cognitive development, there's a couple of examples of the different mental processes that encapsulate cognitive development. Things like knowing, remembering, understanding, communicating, learning. And then there's Bradley Cooper in Limitless, and that whole movie was about cognitive enhancement. So he took the little pill to unlock the full potential of his brain. There's our examples of psychosocial development. So really talking about things like the personality and the influences of social factors on an individual's personality, mental health, and behavior. And then finally, we have physical development, height, weight, muscle mass, how these things change throughout the lifespan. And majority of these changes occur from birth up until puberty. So we have massive increases in physical development from a baby to an adolescent. Then these changes tend to stabilize, and then we do have that biological decline in late adulthood. Okay, so looking at different aspects or different times throughout the lifespan, we have got a few different periods, and these are the terms that we're going to use throughout the rest of the semester. So it's important to have a good understanding of these different terms and their definitions, because so many people use the term childhood or infancy and you're not really sure where the distinction is. So obviously the first one there, the prenatal period, that's when we're in our mum's tummies. It's from conception right up until birth. Then we have infancy, so the first 2 years. Early childhood is from 2 to around 5 to 6 years, and that 5 to 6 signals when we go to school. So early childhood is that preschool period, and then it moves into middle childhood when we start to attend school, so going to kindergarten at around 5 to 6 years. And middle childhood lasts till approximately 12 years, or the onset of puberty. So whenever puberty begins, that's when adolescence begins, which is the next stage. And adolescence lasts from that onset of puberty to around 18 to 20 years. Then we move into early adulthood from 20 to 40. However, between that adolescence and early adulthood period, some scientists have theorized that there's actually another period in between those, and they call it emerging adulthood. So we go from adolescence to emerging adulthood to early adulthood. And that emerging adulthood period is the transitional period between adolescence and adulthood. It's probably where most of you guys figure you are at right now. It's where we're exploring our identity still. We've got these unstable lives and filled with these challenges. We're trying to find a job. We're having new relationships. We don't have too many obligations to others, and we're free to focus on our own needs. So it's adult-like in some ways, but not in others. So it's that transitional period between adolescence and early adulthood. Okay, then we move on to middle adulthood, 40 to 65 years, and then finally late adulthood, which is 65 years and older. Now, there are many different scientists who have tried to understand the way that we develop through these periods into who we are today. And we're going to take a deeper look at these 4 developmental theorists throughout the semester. So we're going to have a look at these 4 developmental theorists closely throughout the semester. So 4 old guys who lived back when life was black and white, and they're going to tell us a lot about how we developed into who we are today. So we've got Piaget, Vygotsky, Erikson, and Freud. Now, Piaget and Vygotsky, the first 2 there, they were concerned with our cognitive development. And they wanted to know how we go from being this baby who knows relatively nothing to a functioning adult with, significant brain power and cognitive abilities. So they both looked at how our brain or our cognitive processes developed. Now, whilst Piaget and Vygotsky both looked at cognition, Vygotsky took a more social approach. So he thought that our environment really influenced our cognitive processes more so than our genetics. Erikson and Freud both looked at psychosocial development. So they looked at our aspects of personality and our psychology and how those change throughout the lifespan. Now, you might have heard of Freud before, and he's quite a controversial character. You can probably tell looking at that photo, he looks a bit sus. But we're going to talk about some of the crazy things that he proposed when we get into psychosocial development in a couple of weeks. Now, whilst these theorists gave us the foundations of what we know about human development today, there is still one big developmental issue that is generally unanswered, and almost all development comes back to this one issue, and it's that of nature versus nurture. So is development primarily a product of nature, which includes our hereditary, our genes, our biology, or is it a process of nurture, so our environment, how we grew up, our experiences, our learning experiences, and also our socio-cultural influences? Now, any aspect of development can be brought back to this question. Our height, our behavior, our personality, our morals, even the way that we look can be dictated by nature versus nurture. And generally the answer is somewhere in the middle. However, there are people who argue from a true nature perspective, and there's those that argue from a true nurture perspective. So a strong believer in nature thinks that the difference between person to person and among children or adults are largely because of differences in genetic makeup and our physiology. And by contrast, a strong believer in nurture would emphasize the environment. They believe that the physical environment that we grow up in, so where we live, and the social environment, so things like our learning experiences, our education, where we went to school, how we were raised, what sort of techniques did our parents use to raise us, our cultural context, whether we were brought up in religious families or cultural families, our socioeconomics, so whether we were poor or rich. These nurture believers would say that human development can take many different forms. It depends on the individual's experiences over a lifetime. Now, there's a few really hotly debated topics related to nature versus nurture, and those are listed here. So some things like high blood pressure, obesity, our personality, and and homosexuality is one where, we don't have the answers, but there is an argument for both sides. So an example of this debate is whether high blood pressure and obesity is a health risk that's passed genetically from our parents to us, or do we acquire the risk of high blood pressure and obesity because of our environmental aspects. Now, someone who was on the nurture side of the debate would say that genetics have a high impact on obesity and high blood pressure, whereas someone on the nurture side of the debate would say that learned eating habits influence the risk of these problems. Another example is the development of personality. Now, people want to know how children develop their personalities. And if you think about you and your parents, you might have some personality traits in common. You might both be funny. Maybe your mum's really funny and you're really funny. Or maybe, your dad is very introverted and you feel like you're very introverted as well. Now, is that because of hereditary? Did your parents give you those genetics so you're predisposed to being introverted or being funny? Or is that a factor of nature? Is it because you grew up under the direct presence of your mom or of your dad that it's a learned personality, not genetically passed? So it's an interesting side for that debate in personality. Now, the last one is homosexuality. It's one of the most debated topics on nature versus nurture today. Those who believe in nature would say that homosexuality is genetic or it's outside of a person's control. It's not a choice.
And those that believe in nurture would say that homosexuality is a choice, or it's a behavior that's influenced by environmental factors. So some really interesting debates on nature versus nurture, depending on what topic you're talking about.
Now, I actually asked you guys this question in our poll activity back in week 1. So you were asked whether biological influences or environmental influences contribute to development the most. So most people said there was an equal balance between biological and environmental factors, so between nature and nurture. A few people said that environmental factors contribute somewhat more. Also, a few people said that biological factors contribute somewhat more. And then there was 5% of people, just a few of you, that thought that environmental factors contribute far more than biological factors. Now, this is a bit of a trick question because you were asked which one contributes to development the most. Now, we know that there's different aspects of development, and really this question is only fair depending on what your definition or idea of development was. So for example, if we think about development of height, we know that our height is highly influenced by biological factors. In terms of height, biological factors would contribute far more than environmental factors. However, there is some environmental effect on height, which we're going to discuss later in the lecture. So that's height. And if we think about something on the opposite side, something like IQ, which does definitely have a genetic aspect, however, it is more influenced by environmental factors, like how we grew up, where we went to school, our level of education, and the opportunities that we were presented with throughout our life. So depending on what aspect of development you thought of when you read this question, that would affect your answer. Now, what we really need to understand though is that nature and nurture, so both biological and environmental factors, are at play in almost every aspect of development. And we're going to discuss that further when we talk about genetics. So in the next part of this lecture, we're discussing conception and genetics. So we've done part 1, health and physical activity. We've done part 2, lifespan development. And now in part 3, we're going to cover conception, genetics, heredity, and the influence of the environment. So we're going to discuss how different traits like eye color, our hair color, our risk of disease, our athletic ability are transmitted from parents to offspring. And so to understand that, firstly, we need to look at how we are conceived. So conception, man and woman get into an entanglement. The female gives an ovum and the male gives a sperm, and there we are, you're a zygote. So the zygote is the earliest stage of development. It's that little picture of that cell there. That's what you all looked like at some stage. Now, if we have a look at the things that influence our development in a biological way and help us and determine who we're going to become, these are all held within our genetic code. So this is just the nature aspect of development. So it's the biological aspects. And we've got DNA, genes, and chromosomes. So they are all contained in the nucleus of the cell. Now, in its simplest form, we have DNA. Now, this is the most basic level of our genetic code. DNA, it's the double helix molecule whose chemical code makes up our genes and our chromosomes. And the DNA serves as like our genetic blueprint. Then we have the level 2, which is the genes. Now, genes are the sequences of DNA. So a gene is a strand of DNA that serves as a template to produce proteins. And these proteins are what make us who we are. And the genes are what are transmitted from parent to child. Now, chromosomes are the thread-like structures. You've seen, I'm sure, a few pictures of those in biology. They're made up of our DNA and our genes. Almost all human cells contain copies of the 46 chromosomes. So there's 23 pairs that are provided from mum and 23 pairs provided from dad at conception. So if we have a little look closer at DNA, DNA is read like a code, and it's made up of these 4 types of chemical building blocks called nucleotides: adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. So A, C, T, G, and you've probably heard those acronyms before. Now, the order of these letters in the code and the way that they're paired together allows DNA to function in different ways. And these codes change slightly from person to person to influence your genes and help make you who you are. So if you take the DNA from a single human cell and stretch it, it would be 6 foot long. So like the height of a tall man, or the height of like 6 foot long subways. So that's just from one cell. If you have a closer look at genes, now genes are the sequences of DNA, and we said that they code for proteins that build things, and they're building things like our freckles, our eye pigment, our hormones that help, regulate our behavior. If we have a look at that figure there on the right, we can see our DNA strand and then the sequence of that being the gene. So a portion of the DNA being the gene. Now, all genes are written in that same language, that ACTG, and the human genome contains over 20,000 genes. So whilst there's a lot of genes, that only makes up 1 to 2% of the length of your DNA. And those genes can be anywhere from 300 to 1 million nucleotide pairs long. So the nucleotide pairs being those horizontal lines that you see throughout that DNA. Now, individuals have different traits largely because of differences or mutations in their genetic codes. However, the differences are not as much as you might have previously thought. Now, between 2 people, the similarities between the genetic code is around 99.5%. Between identical twins, it's 100%. So identical twins are really interesting to lifespan developmentalists because they allow them to study these 2 people who have the exact same genetic makeup. And if we look at them in different environments, we can calculate how much different traits are influenced by the environment. So we're going to look at some of the correlations between traits of identical twins that were raised in different environments. And if they're raised in different environments, the differences that we see in their traits can be explained by the environment. So identical twins, they're monozygotic. They have 1 egg and 1 sperm that splits into 2. If you have an incomplete split of that zygote, that's where you have conjoined twins, and they share 100% of their genetics. Now, fraternal twins or non-identical twins, they're dizygotic. So it's where mum produces 2 eggs and they get and they meet up with 2 different sperm. So fraternal twins are really like normal siblings. They don't share the same genetic code. They're 2 different eggs and 2 different sperm. So they're just like siblings that are born at the exact same time. Now, if we have a look at the similarity in the genetic codes between humans and different animals, so in this figure, each dot represents a sequence of 500,000 nucleotide pairs in the order that they appear in our chromosomes. So the color of the dot represents how well the human sequence matches up with the sequence in a chimp or a gorilla. Now, a red dot signifies a greater difference between the 2, and a yellow dot signifies that they are the same. So we can see that we don't have too much in common with a gorilla. However, we've got quite a lot in common with a chimp. So they've estimated that the similarity between humans and chimps in their genetic code is around 96 to 98%. Now, if we have a closer look at the chromosomes, we've got 23 pairs of chromosomes, we've already said. We've got 46 in total. Now, one from each pair comes from your mother and one comes from your dad. The 23rd chromosome pair is the one which tells us our biological sex. So an XX chromosome is a female and an XY chromosome is male. And we can see in this picture here, we've got an XY, and that's signified by that one longer chromosome and the one shorter on the other side. So the short one is the Y, the longer one is the X. If we know that one comes from mum and one comes from dad, when we look at conception, we know that mum can only donate an X because a female is an XX chromosome. All of her eggs are going to carry the X. Now, dad is an XY, so he can donate either an X or a Y through the sperm. So whether that sperm is carrying the X or the Y. Now, that means that the father determines the gender of a baby. Also important to note that our reproductive cells, our egg and our sperm, carry only 23 chromosomes, so that when they meet and combine, there's a total of 46. Now, depending on the chromosomes given to us by our parents, we can try to understand heredity. So why we look similar to them or why we look different to them. For example, if you're thinking about why do I have brown eyes when my mum's got blue eyes but my dad's got brown eyes? So those classic sort of heredity studies and the dominant and recessive traits we're going to look at now. So the traits that we inherit are influenced by either dominant or recessive gene variants. Now, dominant traits mask the appearance of a recessive trait when they're paired together. And then a recessive trait can only be expressed when it's paired with another recessive trait. So to get a better understanding of this, we look at these things called Punnett squares. Now, a bit of a weird example, but think about your earwax. Do you have wet or dry earwax? Do you know if your parents have wet or dry earwax? I'm not sure if anyone's going to know that. It might be a little bit weird if you do know whether your parents have wet or dry earwax. Anyway, so wet earwax is dominant and it's expressed as this capital W on this page here. Dry earwax is recessive and it's expressed as the lowercase w. Now, in most of these Punnett squares, the recessive gene or the recessive variant is always expressed as a lowercase letter, and the dominant variant is expressed as this capitalized letter. So, if mum carries a lowercase w and a capital W, so she carries one gene of dry and one wet. My mum is going to have wet earwax because wet is dominant, so it's going to mask the dry gene. Now, dad has two dries. That means that he's going to have dry earwax. So even though dry is recessive, it's not paired with wet, so he's going to express dry earwax. Now, when I'm conceived, my mum can give me either the wet or the dry gene. My dad can only give me dry because that's all he has. And that means that if we look at this square here, I have a 50-50 chance of having wet or dry earwax. If I have the capital W paired with the lowercase w, I'm going to have wet earwax. That's the same here. However, if I have the lowercase w and the lowercase w, so dry and dry, I'm going to have dry earwax. Now let's look at another example of this. And we're going to use some more technical terms now. If we're thinking about the wings of a fly, so normal wings are dominant and wrinkled wings are recessive. The allele is the variant form of the gene. So a capital W or a lowercase w. So a capital W signaling the normal wings and a lowercase w signaling the wrinkled wings. Now, the genotype is the organism's genetic inheritance. So
the genotype is either going to be capital W, or lowercase w with a capital W, or it's going to be lowercase w. So the allele is the singular variant. The genotype is what you receive from your parents, and then the phenotype is the observable characteristic. So the phenotype is either normal wings or wrinkled wings. The key to remembering this is that you can't see your genotype, but you can see or measure your phenotype. So in the terms of these flies here, if they're going to have two uppercase alleles, that's going to create the capital W genotype, which is going to result in normal wings phenotype. Okay, so a couple of new terms there. And then this chart goes through many examples of different dominant and recessive traits. So, for example, the basic ones that we all know is that brown eyes are dominant and blue eyes are recessive. Brown hair is dominant and blonde hair is recessive. Sorry guys, but baldness is dominant and a full head of hair is recessive. And that's a little bit unfair, because then we look at body hair and abundant body hair is dominant and no body hair is recessive. I don't know about you guys, that just seems unfair that a bald head and abundant body hair is the dominant traits. Now, unfortunately, there are genetic disorders. Sometimes things go wrong in the conception process. We don't know why, or sometimes there are diseases that are passed down, whether they're dominant or recessive. Now, the most common of these genetic disorders is Down syndrome. And Down syndrome is characterized by a third 21st chromosome. So you can see it circled there. You should have only 2, and in this case, there's 3. Now, they're unsure of the causes of Down syndrome. However, the incidence of Down syndrome increases greatly with the age of the mother. So it's about 1 in 1,400 for a 20-year-old woman, compared to 1 in 30 chance for a 45-year-old woman. So that's a pretty significant increase in the incidence. Down syndrome results in physical growth delays, intellectual disability, and also the characteristic facial features. Now, having a look at these chromosomes here, is this a boy or a girl that we're looking at? Have a look for that 23rd chromosome, and we can see that there are 2 X's. Now, that must mean that this is a girl. So 2 X chromosomes is a girl, and X and a Y is a boy. Okay, another genetic disorder, this is a recessive genetic disorder, is cystic fibrosis. Now, it's a recessive disorder, so that means that both parents must carry the cystic fibrosis gene to pass it on. If you carry the cystic fibrosis genes, you wouldn't be symptomatic because it's recessive. So if we look at this Punnett square on the side, we can see that the father is carrying 1 dominant and 1 recessive cystic fibrosis gene. So the dominant in this case would mask the recessive, and the father would go through life without ever having cystic fibrosis. And the same goes with the mother. If these 2 people had a child, there would be a 1 in 4 chance that this child would be born with cystic fibrosis. So the child with cystic fibrosis would be this one here, right? Because these ones all have a capital C, so they would get masked by the dominant trait. The cystic fibrosis, it's this buildup of mucus in the lungs and the digestive system. The life expectancy is around 38 years, but it's getting better and better. Now, what's a little bit scary is that 1 in 25 people carry the cystic fibrosis gene, so it's not uncommon at all. Now, an example of a dominant genetic disorder is Huntington's disease. It's a really horrible disease. It's associated with the breakdown of nerve cells in the brain, and it results in this decline in movement and cognition.
Now, the problem with Huntington's disease is that the onset doesn't occur until about 30 to 50 years old. So a person might be carrying the gene and not know it because symptoms don't appear until later in life. So if they have a child, there's a 2 in 4 chance, or a 50-50 chance, that the child will end up with the disease. So we can see here we've got one person carrying the Huntington's disease, symbolized by the capital H, and then one recessive gene. And then the other person just carrying the 2 recessive genes. Now, because Huntington's disease is dominant, you've got the 50-50 chance of getting it. So if you have that capital H in there, you are going to get the disease. If you have 2 lowercase h's, you aren't going to get Huntington's disease. This is how dominant and recessive genes work. We can plot them in a Punnett square and we can figure out the probability of a child inheriting certain traits. Now, this isn't just for diseases. We can also do the same thing with eye color and hair color. Okay, so over the next few slides, we're going to talk about the way that biology or our genes interact with the environment. For example, you might carry a gene for anxiety, but you've never been in a stressful situation, and so your anxiety never appears, and you never know you've been carrying the gene that puts you at risk for it. Or perhaps your genetics predispose you to a high IQ. You might be a genius. You could be the next Einstein, but you're brought up in a poor family and weren't able to go to school because you had to look after your brothers and sisters, and you never become aware of your genius potential. Actually, the man in the world right now, the living person who has the highest IQ, works as a security guard at a nightclub. So just because we have genetics that predispose us to a certain trait does not necessarily mean that that trait will appear or express itself. There's this constant interaction between genes and our environment. Now, Bronfenbrenner created this model of development, which emphasizes the roles of nature and nurture as the developing person interacts with a series of environmental systems. So we've got the person in the middle, so the biological person, their physiological characteristics, and their genetics. Around the person, we've got the microsystem. The microsystem is the closest environmental system, which includes the immediate settings in which the person functions. So things like school, family, your peers, whether you go to daycare, any other educational settings, even the neighborhood environment. Now, the macrosystem involves the interrelationship between these microsystems. So it's represented by that red circle that travels around from the microsystem components. An example of a mesosystem is teenagers who experience stressful events at home, like frequent arguments with the family. And those teenagers generally report poor school attendance and difficulty in learning. So it's the effect of one microsystem on another. Now, the exosystem are the settings not experienced directly by the individual, but which still influence their development. For example, children can be affected by how their parents' day at work went, or by a decision from the government to modify the school curriculum. The macrosystem is the larger cultural or subcultural context of development. So it includes obviously culture, the political systems, and the nationality of where someone is born. And then finally, there is the chronosystem, which is the way that changes in environmental systems, so things like social trends and life events, move over a person's life. So things like technology, the advancement of technology. Almost everyone in primary school has an iPhone now, where 10 years ago that wasn't the case. Economic crisis can very much influence a person's development at any stage in their life. Things like divorce or a very appropriate one is a pandemic. So it affects the way that we interact with our friends and our school and our family, and that affects the way that those things work together. The way that we can study genetic traits and environmental influences is by looking at identical twins, like we said before. Now, there's many studies where twins are separated at birth and then they're studied throughout their lifespan to measure how much the environment influences genetics. Now, we know that identical twins have identical genetics, so any differences in the traits of the twins can be explained by the environment that they're brought up in. Now, the Human Genome Project, it's this huge genetic project to try and explain all of the genes in the body, has revealed a lot about the genetics, and they found that the importance of the environment in influencing gene expression over a lifetime is generally being neglected. So they're saying that people aren't understanding the role of the environment enough. Now, this genome project compared the traits of twins who were separated at birth, and because they have the same genes, we'd expect to see a correlation between certain things like eye color, hair color, because they're heavily influenced by genetics. So let's have a look at what they found. So this figure shows the correlation of different traits between twins separated at birth. A score of 1 would mean that the twins are exactly the same in that certain trait. The lower the number means the less the twins shared in common. So given that these people share 100% of their DNA and genetics, it's interesting to see that they weren't the exact same height. So the correlation of 0.86 for height, it means that they're very similar in height, but there is a difference, and that difference has to be environmental. Now, we're going to talk more about height and the environmental influences of height in the next part of the lecture. But before then, I want you guys to try and think of how the environment can affect our height. What do you think is the interaction there? So there were close similarities between brain activity at 0.8, between weight and IQ score. So we can assume that those factors are heavily influenced by genetics. Now, environmental influences had the greatest effect on things like personality, religion, and social attitudes. Okay, so let's have a look now at some specific examples of how the environment may facilitate the expression of genes. So a group of researchers looked at the probability of a major depressive episode and compared that to genetic factors that may increase the risk of depression. What they found was that if you have 0 stressful life events, like you never lose a loved one or you never have to deal with a serious health issue, your genes have no effect on the likelihood of depression. So if you carry 2 high-risk genes for depression versus if you carry 2 protective genes of depression, the odds is that you'll never experience depression if you don't go through some sort of stressful life event. Now, the odds of a depressive episode by the age of 26 is the highest for those individuals who inherit 2 genes known to increase the risk of depression and experience 4 or more stressful life events between the ages of 21 and 26. So you can see there that even those people with the 2 high-risk genes have the same odds at 0 and 1 stressful life events, and they're really only at a higher risk than those with the protective genes when you get to 3 to 4 and over stressful life events. So this is a classic example of a gene-environment interaction. Now, the effects of genetic makeup on depression depend on how stressful a person's environment is, and the effects of stressful life events depend on the person's genotype. Now, it's not nature or nurture. It's this complex interplay of genetic and environmental influences from conception to death that is important. If we look at another example of this study that investigated the effects of childhood adversity on aggression, as measured by conduct disorder, which is it's a psychiatric test, and it's a test that measures antisocial behavior and aggression. Now, the study found that males with a low activity of monoamine oxidase A were much more likely than those with a high activity of the same gene to be diagnosed with an aggressive disorder, even when they both experienced the same amount of childhood adversities. So the childhood adversities included things like domestic violence, abuse, or neglect. So those with low activity and low level of exposure to adversity didn't express the same antisocial or aggressive behavior, even though they carried the same mutation of the gene. However, if they never were exposed to these childhood adversities, it doesn't matter what gene they had, it was likely that they're not going to express this antisocial or aggressive behavior. All right, so quick recap on part 3 of this lecture. We have 46 pairs of chromosomes that carry our DNA and our genes. Many genes are the same for every human being. There's slight differences in the genes that account for the differences between human beings. Now, the dominant traits mask the expression of the recessive ones. The expression of most traits are influenced by nature and nurture. Things like height, weight, and IQ, they're all somewhat influenced by both. And then the expression of some traits are heavily influenced by environmental factors. So things like depression, antisocial behavior, social attitudes, and personality. Now, this gene-environment interaction means that the environment influences how genes are expressed, and that genes influence how people react to the environment. Therefore, people are shaped by this complex interplay of genetic and environmental influences over the lifespan. Okay, so we've gone through part 1, 2, and 3 of the lecture, and now we're going to discuss the effect of genetics on athletic performance. So the nature versus nurture debate is going to appear again in this discussion, and the main question of this part of the lecture is, are athletes born or are they made? Is it their genetics or is it their training? Now, the training, the diet, and the mental fitness are all very important contributors to achieving athletic success. If we have a look at Carl Lewis, and if we compare his body type to all of the successful sprinters, we notice that they all look the same. They all have that muscular body type. And then when we look at the marathon runners, they all look the same as well. They're all quite short and quite skinny. So the fact that the top athletes in particular sports all share many of the same physical attributes suggests that there's an effect of genetics. Like all high jumpers are very tall, all gymnasts are quite short and quite muscular. Now, this argument is also supported by the fact that we see family members competing in the same events. For example, the Brownlee brothers are triathletes who took first and second place in the Rio Olympics, and you can see one of them's not looking too good there. But also at Rio, there were triplets who competed against each other in the marathon. There's also Serena and Venus, classic example. And then closer to home, we have athletes like Maddie and Joey Johns in the NRL. So we could argue that because these siblings likely grew up in the same environment, they probably undertook the same training underneath the same coach, it might be an effect of nurture. Or we could argue that they were genetically predisposed to athletic success in their sports. So let's have a look at some of the genetic factors that influence performance. And the biggest predictor of performance is sex. So sex is entirely the product of nature. It's our chromosomes. Now, it's important to say that sex is the anatomical characteristics determined by the chromosomes, whereas gender refers to someone's personal identification of one's own gender. Sex is the key predictor of absolute levels of performance. It's biological. For example, the fastest women's marathon world record lies outside of the top 3,000 performances in the marathon. So the fastest women is still outside the top 3,000. Another classic example is when Serena and Venus took on a male tennis player at the 1998 Australian Open. So undoubtedly, Serena and Venus are two of the best female tennis players ever. And in tennis, there's always been this argument that a male competitor of a much lower ranking could still dominate the number one female. So what happened was there was this battle of the sexes where Serena and Venus basically challenged someone who lied, or a male who lied out of the top 200 ranked players to a match, and Serena would go one round with him and Venus would go one round with him. So this guy, Karsten Broch, who was ranked 203, took on the challenge. Now, at the time of this, I think Serena was ranked around 20 and Venus was ranked in the top 10. Broch was 203 out of the males. Now, before the game, this guy, he went and played a game of golf, right? He was relaxing, playing golf. Serena played one set against him, got smashed 6-1. Venus played one set against him, got smashed 6-2. And during the changeovers, he was smoking cigarettes and drinking beer. That's in the middle of the match. As the girls are, exhausted, trying their hardest, this guy is smoking and drinking beers. Some people might say he's a legend, but that's essentially the reason why athletes compete in male and female categories for most sports. Now, another predictor of performance is height. Now, height is sports specific. It's beneficial for some sports like basketball, volleyball, and high jump, but it's not beneficial for other sports like gymnastics or endurance running. Basketball teams actually seek out players who are so tall to play in the NBA, right? So there's this pretty interesting statistic is that if you know someone who is 7 foot between the ages of 20 and 40, there is a 17% chance that he's in the NBA right now. That means if you find 10 people who are honest 7-footers, there's a good chance that 2 of them are playing in the NBA right now. Now, height is interesting. It's highly heritable, but it's also influenced by nurture, by our environment. Nutrition is a big predictor of height. 80% heritable. Now, that does not mean that if you're 180 centimeters tall, that your genetics make up the 140 centimeters and then the rest depends on the environment. It means that 80% of the variation in height among humans can be explained by genetics. So let's look at that 80% heritable a little bit closer. Now, LeBron is 2.6 meters tall and the average male height is 1.75 meters tall. Now, the 80% heritability means that 80% of the variation from the mean can be explained by nature and then 20% by nurture. So 80% of the difference between the average male height and LeBron's height can be explained by genetics. So there have been many specific genes that have been found to be associated with human performance. Now, the very first gene that was discovered to be a predictor of performance was this angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, researchers found 2 variants of this particular gene. There's an I allele that results in improved endurance performance, and then a D allele, which is more of a strength and power performance gene. Now, In the UK, they found a whole heap of climbers, people who go up to high altitude, do really sketchy rock climbing, and they measured the genotype, and they found that a really high proportion of these climbers had the II genotype compared to a control group. There was sort of an average amount of climbers and controls who had the ID genotype, so an equal balance between the two, and then very few climbers who had the DD genotype. Now, those with the II genotype were likely to have a larger than average heart that was capable of pumping oxygenated blood to the muscles quicker than those with the DD genotype. So that I allele is associated with improved endurance performance. Another gene associated with performance is myostatin. So myostatin is a negative regulator of muscle cell growth. So this myostatin gene blocks excessive growth of the muscles. However, in a mutant genotype, this myostatin gene can be absent. Now, the mutation of this myostatin gene where it's absent results in heavy musculature. It's even evident at 6 days old in that picture A, and then even more so in picture B at 7 months old. You can see the size of the calves and the quads there. That's not normal baby fat. You can see the definition of the calf muscles there. Now, I know some of the guys are probably jealous of that baby's calves, but unfortunately, the absence of the myostatin gene is very uncommon. However, the finding of this mutant myostatin gene is quite significant because it gives us the potential for gene therapy treatments for patients with muscle wasting disorders. For example, people who are in bed rest, people who have cancer, coma patients, and the elderly who are losing muscle and therefore losing function and their ability to perform activities of daily living. If we can extract this gene mutation and perform gene therapy with it, there could be some really significant advances in treating those people with those muscle wasting disorders. Now, the final specific gene that we are going to be talking about is alpha-actinin 3 protein, ACTN3. This is probably the most famous gene. If you've heard about genes for performance, it's probably this one. They call it the gene for speed, and it's a component of the contractile fibers in the fast twitch skeletal muscles. So we know that sprinters have a high proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers, and if they have the R allele of this actinin 3 protein, that can help them generate force at a high velocity. Whereas there is an X allele, which is not beneficial for force production. So they actually studied a whole bunch of elite sprinters and found that they have an above average frequency of R alleles compared to the average population. Now, they also studied people of different ancestry and descent, and found that there's a high prevalence of this R allele, so that's the beneficial allele for sprinting, in African populations. So about 84% of people in African populations either have one or two R alleles of this protein. And there's a very low prevalence of the R allele in Eurasian populations, only about 49%. It makes you wonder if that might be the reason why you don't see many Eurasians in the 100-meter sprint final. However, you do see plenty of people from African descent. So if we have a look more closely at the alpha-actinin 3 protein, it's here on chromosome 11. We can see that there's a couple of possible variations of the alpha-actinin 3 gene. You can have the RR genotype, the RX genotype, or the XX genotype, and the XS genotype is not beneficial for power athletes. And in that bottom table there, we can see the frequency of occurrence of different genotypes in different Olympians or athletes. So you can see in those power Olympians, the sprinters, there's a high prevalence of RR and RX. So there's not many getting to the Olympic level with that XX genotype. And then you can have a look and compare that to some of the different sports there as well. So those 3 genes are the most publicized genes that affect athletic performance. However, there's been over 200 genes that have been documented to enhance performance, and they do it in all sorts of different ways. There's been genes that have been linked to increased blood flow in muscles, muscle structure, improved oxygen transport, improved lactate turnover so that you don't get that horrible lactate sick feeling in your muscles from the increase in hydrogen. And there's also been genes linked to increased energy production. However, just because you have one of these genes does not mean that you are going to be successful in a particular sport. For example, people with the R allele of the alpha-actinin 3 protein aren't all going to be Olympic level sprinters. There needs to be that perfect balance between genetics, training and environment, and skill. And to make it to the top, those 3 things need to be optimized. I can remember back last year when we had some year 11 students come into the uni to do some athletic testing on each other. And I was working with a colleague of mine, Steve, and we got one of the girls to jump on a bike and do a test for mechanical efficiency when bike riding. So it measures how efficient you are with producing force through the pedals when you're riding a bike. For example, there's Lance Armstrong, and when he does this, he has a perfect score of efficiency. So we get this girl from year 11 to jump on the bike and do this efficiency test, and a couple of seconds into the test, I see Steve, and he is just like falling off the back of his chair. He can't believe what's in front of his eyes, and he sort of points me in the direction of the screen, and we see she's got an almost perfect efficiency score. So Steve is a cyclist, so he just loves it, and he's amazed at what he's seeing. And he asks the girl, "Oh, what sport do you play? What sport do you play?" And the girl says, "Oh, I play cricket." And Steve says, "Oh my gosh, you need to go and speak to some of my friends at the AIS, which is the Australian Institute of Sport, about cycling. I'll get you in touch with them. I've never seen anything like this in my life." Like comparing her to Lance Armstrong, right? This girl from year 11, and she sort of turns to him, looks at him like he's completely lost his mind, and says, "Oh, no, I think I'd rather focus on cricket." And he's just, his face just dropped. So you can have the natural skill, you can have the genetics, but the environment plays a part as well. I asked you guys in our poll whether you believe that successful sprinters are born or made, and to choose which factor is most important. Now, the most of you chose born and 40% of you chose made. I would definitely agree. I think that without the right genetic makeup, no amount of training could push you to that Olympic level. However, having the correct genetics does not mean you will get to that. You will get to the Olympic level. Okay, so a couple of key points. Sex is the key predictor of performance. A few genes have been closely associated with athletic performance. These are the ACE gene, myostatin, and alpha-actinin 3. Now, genetic makeup isn't the sole determining factor of athletic success. However, it is very important when we get to those heights of athletic performance like the Olympics. Now, training, culture, and opportunity all play an important role. Even someone with the perfect genetic makeup will not reach Olympic level without optimized training and opportunity. All right, guys, that's it for today. Fundamentals of health and lifespan development.